Ken Scott. On January 7th, 2020, Ken Scott heard on the radio that Silver Mountain Resort had received around 18 inches of fresh snow overnight. He was 55 years old, a 30-year veteran of the ski industry, and he was on the mountain by the time the lifts opened. At around 11 in the morning, Ken and his ski partner Rebecca Herlin-Patano rode Chair 4 to Wardner Peak and moved onto a traverse toward a black diamond run called 16-1. The traverse had been closed all season. That morning, after avalanche control work on the upper slopes, it had just been reopened. They never made it to the run. Without warning, the slope fractured. A slab avalanche swept Ken roughly 500 feet down the mountain. He came to rest partially buried, one hand free. Rebecca had ridden out the first slide standing up. Then the second avalanche hit from the same slope. This time the snow simply piled on top of him. Ken was buried under 9 feet of compacted snow, and he could not inflate his lungs. He could not move anything except his eyelids and his toes. He was in total darkness, and he accepted that he was going to die. Rebecca, however, was not buried. She called for help, and within 10 minutes, around 50 rescuers had reached the slope and formed a probe line. 40 minutes in, they struck Bill Fusak, who was unconscious but still alive. Using his location, Rebecca pointed 10 feet farther up the slope. Rescuers found Ken's hand, still raised above him, frozen in a wave. He came out of the snow shouting. 3 of the 7 people caught in that avalanche did not survive. 9 days later, Ken was back skiing on Silver Mountain. Anna Conrad. On March 31st, 1982, Alpine Meadows Ski Resort near Lake Tahoe had been closed for days. Storms had dumped up to 7 feet of snow across the Sierra Nevada. Ski Patrol had suspended operations and the mountain was locked down. 22-year-old Anna Conrad worked there as a lift operator. She and her boyfriend, Frank Yateman, had cross-country skied to the resort that morning to collect her ski pants from her locker before heading back out. They were together in the locker room of the Summit Terminal building. At 3:45 p.m., a massive slab avalanche released from the slope above. It demolished the Summit building, buried the parking lot under 10 to 20 feet of snow, and killed 7 people. Frank Yateman was among them. Anna survived because the wall of the locker room toppled across a bench she had been knocked beneath. The wall held the weight of the snow above her and created a small air pocket, about 2 feet wide and 3 feet long. Total darkness. No food, no way out. She sucked mud and meltwater to stay hydrated and could hear search crews calling her name in the distance. On the 3rd day, a 9-year-old German shepherd named Bridget detected her scent, but a fresh storm was moving in, and the risk of a secondary slide was too high, so rescuers had to back off. 2 days later, Bridget found her again. This time they dug. They reached a small hand pushing through the snow and pulled Anna out 117 hours after the avalanche struck. She had lost her right leg below the knee and the toes of her left foot to frostbite. It was the first live rescue by an avalanche dog in United States history. Anna Maria Rocchia. On March 19th, 1755, an avalanche broke loose from Monte Burel and struck the village of Bergamoletto in the Stura Valley of northern Italy. 30 buildings were swept away. 22 people died on the spot. Inside one collapsed stable, 4 people had taken shelter. 40-year-old Anna Maria Rocchia, her 11-year-old daughter Margherita, her 5-year-old son Antonio, and her sister-in-law Anna. The roof had crumpled around them, but a cavity about 5 feet high remained between the rubble and the snow above. They were sealed in. Above them lay roughly 60 feet of compacted snow. 2 goats had been sheltering with them. Anna Maria's husband Giuseppe had been on the roof shoveling snow when the avalanche struck. He survived on the surface but had no way to reach his family. Underground, the 4 lived on goat's milk, a few chestnuts, raw meat from one of the kid goats, and meltwater that dripped through the rubble. Antonio, the 5-year-old, did not survive. His body remained in the confined space with the others. Above ground, weeks passed. Anna Maria's brother, who lived in nearby De Monte, later said he had a vivid dream in which he saw her alive. As the spring thaw began to soften the upper layers, he and another brother climbed up to the buried village, pushed a long pole through the snow, and heard a faint voice from below. On April 25th, 1755, 37 days after the avalanche, Anna Maria, her sister-in-law, and her daughter were pulled from the snow. All 3 were severely malnourished and unable to stand. The Valzur Boy. By late February 1999, the Austrian Alps were in the grip of the most extreme avalanche conditions Europe had seen in decades. Storms had been pounding the Paznan Valley for weeks. For the first time since the modern 5-level European danger scale was introduced in 1993, forecasters had issued the highest level, Danger 5, very high. On February 23rd, a massive slab avalanche broke from the Grieskogel slope above Galtur in Tyrol. It crossed the Trisana River, plowed into the center of the village, and killed 31 people. Galtur had been considered safe. No avalanche in living memory had reached the valley floor. The following afternoon, a second avalanche struck the nearby hamlet of Valzur. 7 people died. 10 were buried. Among them was 4-year-old Alexander Walter, who had been standing in the hallway of his parents' house with his brother when the wave hit. Most of his family escaped. Alexander did not. A search dog located him buried under a staircase, his core body temperature down to 31 degrees Celsius. He was severely hypothermic, but alive. The weather had grounded most aircraft. Helicopter pilot Walter Stroltz, on his way back to his hotel after hours of work over Galter, took the call. With a police colleague, he flew through the snowstorm and the failing light, lifted Alexander out of Valzur, and brought him to medical care. The flight became known as the Miracle of Valzur. Alexander recovered. 25 years later, he was working in Tyrol with no real memory of the avalanche itself. The Austrian Snowboarder. In January 2000, 3 friends were snowboarding in a ski resort in the western Austrian Alps. The temperature was 14 degrees Fahrenheit, and the avalanche danger was at level 4 on the European scale. At 2:45 p.m., 2 of them decided to descend off-piste from the summit station, around 6,500 feet above sea level. The third stayed on the groomed slope. 3 hours later, when his 2 friends had still not appeared at the bottom, the third friend reported them missing. Search and rescue determined both men had been caught in a spontaneous slab avalanche. The risk of further slides was extreme. At 11:30 that evening, the search was suspended. During the night, another 2.5 feet of snow fell on top of where they were buried. Rescuers returned the next morning. A rescue dog located the first man, and his airway had been blocked by snow. He had likely died within 30 minutes of being buried. 10 minutes later, the same dog found the second man at a depth of more than 2 meters. His ear temperature on the scene was 22.5 degrees Celsius. At hospital, his core temperature was 24.1 degrees Celsius. He had been buried for 20 hours, but he was responsive. He had survived because his airway was clear. A large air pocket sat in front of his mouth and nose, and his goggles had slipped down to seal it. His body temperature had dropped so deeply that his metabolism had effectively shut down, drastically reducing his need for oxygen. He had no frostbite and recovered neurologically. After 4 days in intensive care, he was discharged. Gerhard Freissegger. On the night of January 20th, 1951, 26-year-old Gerhard Freissegger went to sleep at the middle station of a cable railway above Heiligenblut in the Austrian Alps. The cable car was being used to ferry materials for a hydroelectric dam under construction. It had been Gerhard's weekend off, but he had swapped shifts so a married colleague could go home. It had been snowing heavily for days. Around 2 a.m., Gerhard was woken by a splintering crash. The avalanche had struck the hut. He threw an arm in front of his face and was pinned to his straw mattress in the dark. For the first 3 days, Gerhard could hear rescuers walking above him. He shouted, but his voice never carried beyond the snow. Eventually, the rescuers moved on. He was not lost. Working with his fingernails, he began to scrape upward through the hard-packed snow. After about a week, he managed to free his swollen, frost-bitten legs. He found a splinter of wood, probably broken from his bunk, and used it to bore a narrow shaft toward the surface. On February 2nd, 1951, 13 days after the avalanche, he reached the surface. Workers from the cable railway found him and pulled him out. He was alive and able to speak. When they asked how long he thought he had been buried, he said it must have been about 2 months. He was taken to hospital in Lienz with third-degree frostbite, infections of his lungs, kidneys, and bladder, and a 65-pound weight loss. Both legs were eventually amputated below the knee. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and feel free to drop any video suggestions in the comments.